You are listening to the Keep the Weight Off podcast with Dr. Angela, episode number 111.
Welcome to the Keep the Weight Off podcast, where we bust all the dieting myths and discover not just how to lose weight, but more importantly, how to keep it off. We go way beyond the food, and we use science and psychology to give you strategies that work. And now your host, Dr. Angela Zechmann.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the podcast this week. I am still in Wichita. So I'm recording this podcast from an Airbnb in Wichita. So if it sounds a little different, that's why. I have spent the entire week knee deep in everything that my parents ever owned, and it's been absolutely fascinating. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. My siblings and I have just been going through things, hauling stuff down out of the attic, hauling stuff out of bedroom closets. It's been incredible. I actually have found coupons that expired in 1970. Marchelle, you're here listening to this too. Isn't that crazy? I found income tax records from 1960. I found reports from my piano teacher when I was 5. I found old letters that I'd written in college when I was thinking about going to med school and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to get in, So this last week has just been a real trip down memory lane, and my siblings and I mean, we get along really well for the most part. We've had a few little times where we've had some irritations, but for the most part, we're doing great, and we're just having a fun time. But I am going home today, and I'm actually looking forward to that. So how are you doing, Marchelle? You're like home in Washington, where hasn't it been pretty much rainy?
Yeah, yesterday, we had a nice break in the
good.
rain, and we went and hit a few golf balls. But
good.
We're waiting for you to come home.
Yeah. It's going to be nice to be home, actually. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. Well, what I wanted to talk about today is the similarities between highly processed foods and cigarettes. And there are actually some interesting parallels. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because you may remember, if you're a regular podcast listener, we interviewed Dr. Ashley Gearhart. It's been quite a while ago now. I always tell everybody, listen to podcast number 98 and 99. If you're listening to this one now, don't do that now. But after we're done, go back and listen to it if you haven't. Dr. Ashley Gearhart is a researcher in processed food addiction. And she and another colleague of hers wrote a paper about the similarities between nicotine and processed food in terms of its addictive potential. And so that's what I want to walk you through today. Super, super interesting. So I always am talking to my patients. I'm just constantly chat. And I say to them, you don't smoke, right? And they usually say, of course not. Not always, but usually. And when I ask why, they say, well, it's because it's disgusting and it's unhealthy. And I watched my parents struggle with lung disease or lung cancer, and I don't want that. And, sometimes people are former smokers and they worked hard to quit, and they are really proud of themselves for having quit. And they're like, I would never do that again. And, unless you live under a rock, we all know the dangers of smoking. And at least in the United States, I can't speak for every other country in the world, but here in the United States, it's pretty socially unacceptable to smoke. And people who do smoke often do it in secret, right?
Right.
So, Marchelle, you used to smoke, right?
Yes. I have had my bouts with smoking. Of course, when I started smoking, it was, trying to be cool in school. Little did I know that it was so addicting. And I did get addicted to smoking. And I have quit smoking on and off for years. And, I would quit and then something would draw me back. Usually it was when I was drinking socially. Then I would smoke socially, and then I would get re-addicted to it. So it's hard to quit smoking. And then and when you smoke again, you get re-addicted to it. So it's an addiction that is hard to quit. So
yeah. So if you are a listener and you have beat the smoking addiction, I want to say congratulations, because that is wonderful, wonderful news to your body and for your future. So, but what I oftentimes find myself saying to people who are trying to lose weight and keep it off is begin to think about highly processed foods, for example, donuts and Oreos and ice cream and chips and French fries and pizza and soft drinks and coffee drinks, all that stuff, begin to think about it in the same way you think about cigarettes. Okay? So if you can think about a box of donuts or even the Girl Scout cookies that are so popular right now, thinking about these highly processed foods in the same way you think about a carton of cigarettes can be really, really helpful. I mean, you'd never bring a carton of cigarettes to the office on Friday for everyone to enjoy, right?
Right.
Like you just wouldn't do that. Can you imagine that?
No.
We have doctors bringing donuts and bagels into nurses on Fridays, it's a lot of craziness. So
it's so hard because pink donuts are so much prettier than a carton of cigarettes. So.
I know. Well, they used to have really pretty cartons of cigarettes too, and they used to associate it with a lot of like sexual
they
like
did.
really pretty girls.
They used to make it look so glamorous. That's how I got started, because they made it seem so cool. That's how like a lot of us got started back when we were teenagers, because, teenagers want to be cool. I don't know how they duped us on that, but that's how a lot of my friends got started, is we wanted to be cool. So we started smoking, and I don't know how we got duped into that, but yeah.
Yeah. So now donuts and Girl Scout cookies are really cool. So
yeah, right. Yeah.
So I want you to be thinking about these things in the same way. Okay. And I want you to know that the science backs me up. This is not just me spouting Angela-isms. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to go through the science with you so you understand that, yes, highly processed foods are just as dangerous and just as addictive as cigarettes. And they're produced in much the same way that cigarettes are. And they're equally deadly, if not more so. Okay, so you ready?
Yeah.
Here goes. Okay. So I'm basing my statements on a great paper that was written by Dr. Ashley Gearhart and her colleague, Dr. Alexandria De Felice Antonio. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And they published this article in the journal Addiction just this year in 2023, although it was reported in the news last fall. And again, we actually had Dr. Gearhart on this podcast. So we'll put a link to that podcast, those two podcasts, in the show notes for you if you want to go back. So here's what they did. In 1988, and this was when Dr. Gearhart was in grade school, by the way, and when I graduated from medical school, so way back in the day, the Surgeon General published a report indicating that tobacco products are addictive. And this was really a fundamental and sentinel report. It was huge because prior to that, we knew smoking cigarettes was dangerous and could lead to lung cancer and emphysema and cardiovascular disease. We had plenty of evidence for that. But we as a society didn't have a clear recognition that nicotine is actually an addictive drug, and that people who were wanting to quit and having a hard time of it were actually dealing with powerful brain chemistry that was getting in their way. Okay. So this report helped shift the public's perception of cigarettes as not only dangerous, but highly addictive. And it helped to lay the groundwork for the development of new treatments that target addictive mechanisms in the brain. So, for example, the smoking cessation medications they came out, like Zyban and Chantix. It also paved the way for more effective public health campaigns about the risks of tobacco products. Now, this is when we really started to see a lot of taxation on cigarettes. We started to see a lot of advertising for cigarettes going away. We started to see, we already had warning labels on cigarettes at that point in time, but most people just didn't really understand how addictive it was. So what this report by the Surgeon General did was it gave legislators the data that they needed to stop the cigarette advertising and to stop the tobacco industry from targeting adolescent kids like you, right, Marchelle? And minorities in their advertising campaigns. So those of you listeners who were born after 1980 really have no idea how huge of a change this was over a 30-year period. Cigarette smoking used to be the leading cause of preventable death, but it's not anymore, thanks to this understanding and the public will to shift the way we think about the tobacco industry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it does.
Okay, so the Surgeon General used 3 criteria to determine that tobacco products are addictive. The first is their ability to cause highly compulsive use. The second is that they cause mood-altering effects, in other words, psychoactive effects, because of the way they affect the brain chemistry. And the third is that the use becomes reinforcing. So those were the 3 criteria in the Surgeon General report. Since that report was produced, research has identified a 4th criteria that we can use to determine if a substance is addictive, and that is its capacity to trigger strong urges or cravings. Okay? So, to repeat the criteria, compulsive use, number 1. Number 2, mood-altering effects. Number 3, reinforcement. And then the 4th criteria, strong urges and cravings. So we'll talk about what each one of these means because Drs. Gerhardt and DeFelice Antonio took these established criteria for addiction and applied them to processed foods and looked at the research to find out if it's really true that processed food can be addictive. Is this not a fascinating topic?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking I was just at this event recently and I was telling you, I told you about this. I don't know if you remember. And I just got sat in the wrong seat and I did not get anything out of the event because I was sitting next to the food table. This piece of cake talked to me the entire time. I was just sitting, I was just realizing this whole criteria and just how overpowering these processed foods can be. It was just so triggering and just how horrible they can be for you. So I don't know. I was just, that's what I just pictured in my mind. Yeah. So I was getting distracted on that. So how horrible, how horrible are these foods?
Well, one thing I want everybody to understand before I talk about whether processed food meets addiction criteria or not, I want you to know that actually the industrialized production of tobacco products and the industrialized production of highly processed foods are very similar. And this is one thing that Drs. Gerhardt and DeFelice Antonio talk about in their article. So tobacco can actually be hand-rolled, right? And it can be much less addictive if it's hand-rolled. And similarly, people have been making bread and cookies at home for decades without causing an obesity epidemic, right? So you can make bread and cookies at home, and people have been doing that in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Up until the 80s, we didn't have an obesity epidemic. We had a few kids once in a while who were struggling and a few people once in a while who were struggling, but we didn't have a huge epidemic the way we have now.
Right.
So what happens with the industrialized production of tobacco and food products that makes such a huge difference in their addictive potential? That's a good question. So it turns out that when you industrialize this, in other words, you make manufacturing and you have machines do all the work, you create a product that has much higher addiction potential because there's much quicker absorption of the addictive substance. In addition, both the tobacco industry and the food industry use additives that enhance the addictive potential of the substance. So these things are not available to somebody who's just baking bread at home. Not to mention that when something is industrially produced, it can be produced much more quickly and much more cheaply, and it becomes available to more people at a much more affordable price. Okay, so let's take tobacco first. I'm going to read directly from Dr. Gerhardt's paper. Although dried tobacco leaves have been consumed through smoking or chewing since at least AD 800, the development of industrial cigarette rolling machines in the 1880s revolutionized the tobacco industry. Cigarettes could now be rolled at more than 10,000 a minute, compared to just a few a minute when hand-rolled. This technological shift allowed for the mass production of inexpensive industrial cigarettes and the development of the modern tobacco industry. Industrial cigarettes are convenient, accessible, and heavily marketed. Although hand-rolled cigarettes made from processed tobacco can still be addictive and damaging to health, it was the marked increase in cheap, convenient, accessible, and heavily marketed industrial tobacco cigarettes that led to a greater than 1,000% increase in cigarette consumption and a marked increase in smoking-related disease like lung cancer.
Wow,
interesting, huh?
So evil.
So I'm continuing from her paper. Similarly, while homemade bread and cookies that include processed ingredients, for example, sugar and fat, can be consumed addictively and damage health, the rise of cheap, accessible, convenient, and heavily marketed industrial, highly processed foods in the food supply is the major driver of excessive food intake, obesity, and diet-related disease. Commonly consumed highly processed foods include carbonated soft drinks, sweet or savory snacks, chocolate, candies, ice cream, cakes, cookies, bread, and pizza, among many others. Although processed ingredients like white flour, sugar, and butter have long been available for purchase to allow for the creation of homemade highly processed foods, example, fresh baked bread and homemade cookies, a marked increase in cheap, easily accessible, and heavily marketed industrialized highly processed foods began in the 1980s and preceded increases in obesity and diet-related diseases, for example, type 2 diabetes. The dominance of industrial highly processed foods is the result of these products being 1, inexpensive due to the use of cheap but potent industrial substances like high fructose corn syrup and trans fats. 2, highly accessible and convenient due to the additives that allow them to stay shelf stable and ready to eat, right? Think about that. 3, enhanced through additives that amplify somatosensory properties. Now that's what she's talking about there is smell, taste, and texture through substances that are not available to the home cook. For example, flavorants and MSG and guar gum. And number 4, the focus of marketing campaigns that create positive associations and brand loyalty from a young age. Okay, so does this make sense, Marchelle?
Yeah, we have a lot of comments.
I just read a lot of kind of scientific lingo, and I want to make sure.
I know that was a whole lot. That was a mouthful right there.
That was a mouthful,
yeah. It kind of makes me think because a lot of times, when my friends and I talk, about when we were kids, because I grew up in the 80s and we think, like we grew up on, mashed potatoes and we grew up on, meat and mashed potatoes and all this kind of stuff. And, and we were just fine. Well, that's because, the macaroni and cheese and the mashed potatoes and all that stuff, it didn't have all this processed ingredients in it. I mean, it was like it's called the same, it looked the same, but it just wasn't the same. The food is not the same anymore. So
it's not the same.
Yeah, it's just not the same as it used to be. So although you think it's the same, it sort of resembles the same food as we grew up on. It's just really not the same anymore. And it's really scary. It's really scary.
It is really scary. So what they've done in the processing of food is they've added stuff to it to make it shelf stable and really enhance the smell and the flavor and the texture of the food. And that's what enhances the addictive quality of it. They've also made it so that it's cheap and inexpensive. Okay. So those are the similarities between nicotine products and processed food. Now, the other thing I want you to know, want all of you guys to know, is that Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds actually bought Kraft Foods and Nabisco, and they probably bought other food conglomerates as well. So the tobacco companies have become some of the biggest producers of processed foods in the world between 1980 and now.
Of course they did.
Of course they did. So the tobacco industry documents demonstrate that they apply the same playbook from tobacco to increase the profits from their food and beverage portfolios. including, again, the use of flavored additives and marketing strategies to target children and racial and ethnic minorities. I think this is so important to understand. It's like we live in this food environment where these huge conglomerates are working so hard to figure out how to market and sell their toxic products to us, and we get addicted and we blame ourselves for feeling so out of control, not even realizing that this has all been done to us on purpose. It's infuriating, you know? And Marchelle, you and I are up close and personal with all the pain these products are causing for our patients and clients.
Yes, we are.
It's terrible.
I know. It is terrible.
So this is another reason why we need to just boycott these companies that are making this crap. Like, start thinking about donuts and cookies and all of this stuff in the same way you think about cigarettes.
I know. Until we have like public service announcements like we did with the cigarettes, until everybody gets on board with this, we need a movement. We need an entire movement.
We do.
Like we did with the cigarettes, with the cigarette era, where we have a movement on how deadly these processed foods are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the end of part 1 of our foray into the science of processed food addiction and whether or not processed food is addictive as nicotine. And next week, what we're going to talk about is those criteria that I mentioned. I'm going to go through each one of those criteria so that we can determine whether or not processed food is indeed as addictive as nicotine. So that's all for this week, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Hey, if you really want to lose weight and keep it off for good, your next step is to sign up for Dr. Angela's free weight loss course, where you're going to learn everything you need to get started on your weight loss journey the right way. Just head over to journeybeyondweightloss.com/free course to sign up. Also, it would be awesome if you could take a few moments and write a review on iTunes. Thanks, and we'll see you in Journey Beyond Weight Loss.